Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I stand here today at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues as a Glenala State High School representative to speak to you about a problem that is plaguing our society: educational disadvantage of Indigenous Australians. This is a problem that needs to be addressed urgently as it has far reaching consequences for individuals and the wider community. Indigenous Australians are among the most disadvantaged people in our country. They face numerous challenges, including poverty, poor health, and limited access to quality education. This is a problem that has been exacerbated by historical factors such as colonialization, dispossession, and discrimination. Researchers at Monash University, on behalf of Inclusive Australia, conducted a survey on experiences of discrimination, feelings of well being, and belonging, and their perceptions of bias towards minority groups. The survey found the percentage of Indigenous Australians who experienced at least one form of discrimination increased significantly in 2019 from 28.6% to 51.1%. The effects of educational disadvantage on Indigenous Australians are profound. For example, Indigenous Australians are more likely to have low levels of literacy and numeracy. This is a driving factor in why people in Indigenous communities lack the ability to find meaningful employment and participate fully in society. They are also less likely to complete secondary school or attend university, which limits the opportunities for personal and professional development. This claim is backed up by the fact that, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, only 59% of Indigenous Australians aged 20 to 24 have completed Year 12 or its equivalent, compared to 86% of non Indigenous Australians. This is particularly more pronounced in remote and rural communities, which where access, where access to quality education is limited. The reality of the situation is stark. Indigenous Australians are more likely to experience poor health outcomes than non Indigenous Australians. They're more likely to suffer from chronic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, and kidney disease. These health problems can have a profound impact on their learning capabilities and their ability to succeed in school. Let me share with you a story of a young Indigenous girl from the Northern Territory. She was only 10 years old and already struggling with her learning. She had missed a lot of school due to health issues and fallen behind her peers. Her parents are struggling to afford the necessary medical treatment, and it is having a profound impact on her education. This is just one example of the many challenges that Indigenous Australians face. The statistics are alarming. Indigenous Australians are twice as likely to die before the age of 25 than non Indigenous Australians. They're also more likely to be unemployed, homeless, and incarcerated. So, what can we do about it? The solution lies in addressing the root causes of the problem. We need to address the poor health outcomes of Indigenous Australians and the lack of funding from the government for Indigenous education. This will require a concerted effort from all levels of government as well as the wider community. The Australian government has consistently underfunded Indigenous health services. In 2017 to 18, the Australian government spent $9,901 per person on non Indigenous health compared to the $7,877 per person on Indigenous health. This disparity in funding is unacceptable and needs to be addressed urgently. Indigenous Australians continue to experience poor health outcomes compared to non Indigenous Australians. The health gap is a result of historical and contemporary systematic inequalities that impact Indigenous communities, such as poor access to healthcare, inadequate housing, and poor education outcomes. Furthermore, the lack of funding from the government for Indigenous education is also a major concern. Education is essential for closing the gap in health and social outcomes, yet Indigenous Australians continue to experience lower levels of educational attainment than non Indigenous Australians. The quality of education provided in remote Indigenous communities is often inadequate, and there is a shortage of qualified teachers in these areas. This lack of educational resources and support perpetuates the cycle of disadvantage and contributes to the ongoing marginalization of Indigenous Australians. It is imperative that the government invests in education for Indigenous Australians to provide them with the tools and resources necessary to break the cycle and achieve better health and social outcomes. Lastly, the historical mistreatment of Indigenous Australians, including the forced removal of children from their families and the loss of land and culture, has resulted in intergenerational trauma and disadvantage. Investing in healthcare and education for Indigenous Australians is a necessary step towards reconciliation and closing the gap between Indigenous and non Indigenous Australians. It is important for the government to acknowledge the past wrongs and take action to ensure that Indigenous Australians are given the same opportunities as non Indigenous Australians to achieve good health and well being. This can be done by investing in Indigenous teachers, educating and bringing awareness to Indigenous culture, and investing more into basic Indigenous needs. These examples are just a small amount of the things that Australia as a whole can do in improving Indigenous education. In conclusion, we cannot afford to ignore the problem of an educational disadvantage in Indigenous Australians, we need to take urgent action to address the root causes of the problem and ensure that Indigenous Australians have access to the same opportunities as everyone else. This will require concerted effort from all levels of government as well as the wider community. So I urge you all to join me in acting today to ensure that every Indigenous Australian has access to the education they deserve. Thank you.